Social interaction is an important part of traditional classroom learning. When designing online learning experiences, social presence can be fostered through the use of discussion forums, as they provide a platform for both student reflection and interaction. Engaging discussion prompts are a good start. But a disciplined approach to online discussion facilitation is equally important. We'll talk about both. A great discussion reinforces, enriches, and extends the conversation, thus deepening student understanding of the material. So, discussion prompt tip number 1, use open-ended questions. You want to create a question that elicits a number of different responses, as this allows students to question and support their peers, refine their ideas, and ultimately learn from each other. Discussion prompt tip number 2. Engage learners with a search and share activity. Some of your discussion prompts should give students the opportunity to search for information and share resources with one another. This helps reinforce the notion that they're not just passive content consumers, but rather active members of a supportive learning community. Discussion prompt tip number 3. Try audio or video in your prompt. This is a great way for both you and the students to enhance the sense of social presence and humanize the online learning experience. Start simple by adding video or audio to the introductions, as this will help break the ice at the start of an online course. Discussion prompt tip number 4. Create different prompts for different groups. Keep in mind discussion prompts can be directed to the whole class or individualized for small groups. Having multiple smaller discussions is often a more productive strategy. Learners can actively participate in their discussion and simply peruse the others as they see fit. Now, let's move beyond prompts and talk about discussion forum facilitation. Remember that many students may not be familiar with online discussion forums. Here are 6 additional tips for facilitating successful, engaging conversations that promote higher order thinking. Tip number 1, respect. Encourage students to treat each other with respect and carefully read responses before they ever click the submit button. Disagreements should be based on the topic and never made with hostility towards individuals. Including general netiquette guidelines in your course is always helpful. Tip number 2, provide examples of acceptable and unacceptable responses. This will prevent a rash of responses like, great idea, or I completely agree, while also establishing your expectations. You may still receive some simplistic responses, but it should be limited to a few students. Tip number 3, encourage students to pose their own questions. By posing a question at the end of their initial response, this gives others something to respond and reflect upon. This also helps keep the conversation moving forward and extends students' thinking. Tip number 4, provide deadlines for initial responses and replies. Set deadlines for when students should post an initial discussion response and a second date for them to respond to their classmates' posts. These dates should reflect consistent days of the week throughout the course to help establish a course routine. Setting these 2 separate deadlines encourages more thoughtful responses and allows you to see the student's thought progression. Tip number 5, consider grading based on participation rather than on content. Assigning points to a discussion promotes thoughtful feedback. However, since discussions often provide the chance for students to share opinions, it may not make sense to grade the content of the response. Rather, you might consider using a discussion rubric or checklist that assigns points based on the level of student participation, thoroughness, and clarity of response. Tip number 6, don't dominate the discussion. Discussions are an excellent way for students to interact with other students and with the instructor. But to prevent the conversation from being instructor-dominated, try to let students respond with each other first and interject only as necessary to reorient the conversation. When you do interject, consider responding to student posts with questions that promote further reflection or with a link to additional resources. You might also consider assigning a rotating group of students to facilitate the discussion. By providing opportunities for student-to-student interaction, we as instructors help encourage participation, promote critical thinking, and facilitate the creation of a strong community of learners. And that is a beautiful thing.